Still takes a lot to get used to. Bread is rarely just bread, and a meal is rarely just a meal. In some significant ways, my life has unfolded as a series of meaningful meals. I think of Sunday steak and twice-baked potato dinners with my family growing up, or waiting tables at our church's Shrove Tuesday pancake supper as a kid, or the first time going out to eat with my friends after getting my driver's license, or those classroom conversations that continued over lukewarm French fries in a college dining hall. I think of mountaintop meals with strangers deep in the Caucasus Mountains, mid-hike peanut butter and jelly sandwiches amidst the silence of fresh snowfall. I think of intergenerational bonds formed over food grown in a convent garden, a multi-course dinner for friends that I couldn't really afford to make, frantic last-minute prep work for seminary community dinners, unexpected connections at a church's feeding ministry, or Nicole's, Francis, and my first dinner together at home as a family. I could list all of the meals that have meant something to me, and I could go on for hours and hours. The memories stick out in my mind so vividly. But there's one thread that runs through them all. I don't remember them because of the food. Yes, there have been some memorable dishes along the way. There are flavors, there are meals, there are foods that I can still taste, can still feel the texture of, can still remember the aroma of. But even those remarkable dishes don't stand out just because of how they tasted. I remember those meals because they drew me closer to other people. They forged connections, camaraderie. It wasn't the food, but the experience that stands out. All of those meals fed me physically, but also in some way spiritually. I was nourished by the company as much as the calories. They provided a sustenance deeper than an end to physical hunger. Bread is rarely just bread, and a meal rarely just a meal. And I imagine you all could plot your own journey through life with those significant meals that you shared with others. That you could describe many of them in vivid detail, recalling all the sights, sounds, aromas, textures, tastes, as well as the people who were there around the table with you. The warmth and satisfaction of good company and full stomachs. There's something that happens over a meal that we experience few other places. Those shared meals are places of encounter, of coming together. They are essential to our lives, and yet they also enrich our lives, deepen our experience of one another and of the world. I think it's for that reason that ritual meals and rhythms of feasting and fasting have been central to so many cultures and the world's religions, both past and present. If you look at almost any religion, you don't have to look far to see its values, its core beliefs embodied in its attitudes and practices around food. I'll never forget traveling through Ankara, Turkey, during the season of Ramadan, during those holy days in the calendar in Islam, and passing by a mosque just before sundown, seeing dozens of families gathered in the courtyard, blankets spread and picnic baskets ready, just waiting for the sun to dip below the horizon so they could break their fast. After a day of not eating, of abstaining even from water, they were just as hungry for a chance to be together as they were for the sweetness of those 3 dates that the Prophet Muhammad is believed to have eaten to break his fast. Food is more than food. A meal is more than just a meal. It sustains more than just our physical selves. The story of the people of Israel is also one of significant meals. from that illicit one shared in the Garden of Eden, to Abraham and Sarah hosting angels unaware, the hospitality of Lot, the Passover feast, the manna that God gave the Israelites who were wandering through the desert for 40 years. The Old Testament is full of sumptuous feasts and ritual meals. God is constantly revealing God's self through the gift of food. And that sharing of food is so often a reminder that God is present to God's people, that God has not abandoned them. Through the meals they share, the people of Israel remember who and whose they are. Food is a gift. The promise of paradise is the promise of abundant food, the entry into a land of milk and honey. It is out of that context that Jesus speaks the words of our gospel today. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. He promises to nourish his disciples with food that is more than food. And in doing so, speaks to that Jewish tradition that remembers God revealing God's self through the gift of meals. Yet he takes it one step further. The bread that he invites his disciples to share isn't just about remembering what God had done in the past. The bread he offers to his disciples is the bread of eternal life. He offers them a spiritual nourishment to quell their deepest hunger, their deepest longings. He promises them food that will never leave them hungry again, but will fill the whole of their lives, every inch and ounce of their being. In Jesus, the full potential of what a meal can be, physical and spiritual nourishment bound together, find their culmination and highest form. Every week we gather at this table. We share in a meal. We share bread that is more than bread. That meal is more than just a meal. By sharing the Eucharist each week, we are drawn into the presence of the living God, and God is united to us as we are united to God. In that meal that we share, all boundaries fall away. The boundaries between me and you, between insiders and outsiders, between us and them, between us and God. In the words of Jesus, those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Of all the ways that God could have chosen to reveal God's self, I think it's significant that God chose a meal. It reminds us that our spiritual selves aren't separate from our physical selves. We are one integrated whole, not separate beings, physical, spiritual. We are one. We have needs that extend throughout, that are not just physical needs or spiritual needs. There's the same fundamental need. Our bodies need to be fed along with our spirits. Our hungers, our spiritual hunger, our bodily hunger, they're connected to one another. And acknowledging that fundamental need that we share is at the heart of what it is to be a follower of Christ. The spiritual and the material are one. We're called to tend both sets of needs in the world around us. It's not enough just to pay attention to the spiritual needs in our community and in the world while ignoring the very real material ones. Telling a starving person that they are saved does little good unless you're also willing to offer them something to eat. And likewise, meeting the material needs and ignoring the spiritual ones is just as hollow. I think of the traditional models of charity in the church that were all about offering food, clothing, money, etc., but always at a distance, that never risked actually building relationships, reaching across barriers that divide us from one another. And while offering the resources that we have is important, it can be so much more when done in the context of a very real and close relationship. So many soup kitchens for so long were about having the people serving on one side of the counter and the people being served on the other side. The two groups never mixing, never engaging in conversation, never finding common ground, never seeing beyond the physical needs to acknowledging the shared spiritual hunger that exists from people of all walks of life. That kind of charity may be able to provide a temporary stay to hunger, but it fails to acknowledge the need for connection and community. It fails to offer anything more than food, which is what Jesus calls us to in this gospel today, to seek after a food that is more than food, bread that is more than bread. The mission of the church is to share the bread of life with the world, to meet the hunger of the world in all its forms, to offer physical and spiritual sustenance that invites God's presence into our lives and into our communities. Jesus promises that through the bread of life, he will be present to his disciples, not in an amorphous or metaphorical sense, but in a real and physical one, in a tangible way. By inviting them to eat his flesh and drink his blood, he promises his followers that he will nourish their bodies along with their spirits, that he sees them as whole selves in all of their hunger, all of their need. The bread that he gives is the bread of eternal life. And that's what is on offer when we gather each week around this table. God present in body and blood. The bread that we eat and the wine that we drink is more than just a symbol. It's an opportunity to come into contact with God, to abide in Jesus and for him to abide in us. It's a chance for our hungers to be sated, the nourishment we need to share that same meal with the world. I pray that as we gather around this table today, we will be nourished by this meal. That as we come into the presence of the mystery of God, we will find ourselves being transformed more and more into the image and likeness of God, so that we may be Christ's body in the world throughout the rest of the week. I pray that this bread may be more than bread, this meal more than a meal, and that by this food, we will find ourselves filled by the presence of God. Amen.